the place that you've provided for us to gather, to study your word, to fellowship with each other in your truth, to pray together and petition you to do that which is good for your people and brings the most glory to yourself. Thank you for Christ. I pray that you would open our eyes to behold wonderful truths from your law, inform our intellect, assault rebel wills, and stir our affections, make us greater lovers of Christ for our time together. We'll be cautious to give you all the praise in your Son's name. Amen. So as we come to our study tonight, I want to remind us that, let me hang things on three different concepts. When we do exegesis, we're seeking to extract from the Bible the meaning rather than impose our thoughts and meanings on the text. And in Bible exposition, we're going to the text, we're instructing in the meaning, and we're exhorting with that same text so that we be doers of the word, not hearers only. So this study through the Pentateuch is exegetic, it's expositional, and it's biblical theology. We're extracting the theology so that we are driven by God's truth rather than our own sinful passions. And so we come tonight to the fourth book of Moses, the book of Numbers, from pilgrimage to possession. The book of Numbers shows us how God responded to the unbelief of the Israelites. There are consequences to our disobedience, but God's grace remains, and his redemptive plan and desire for us will not be thwarted. That's good news. The book of Numbers underscores for us the importance of obedience in the life of a believer. Now, as we go back to the Old Testament and go to Numbers, let's pass through the New Testament for just a moment. Let's remind ourselves theologically of what Paul tells us our advantage is in knowing the first two-thirds of our Bible. In Romans 15:4, he'd said to the saints at Rome, whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So they had the Old Testament that they grew up on, and what is written therein is written for us to be instructed by. It's got value to our lives. In other words, we are short-sighted and lacking severely when we don't learn our Old Testament. He would say the similar sort of thing to the saints at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 10. 1 Corinthians 10:6, he said, now these things happened as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So in 1 Corinthians and Romans, Paul says that these are written for our instruction, and in 1 Corinthians he also mentions that these are examples. When you read other people's names in a different place, in a different time, we remember that we as them, right? We may not literally be them, but they show us what we're like. And so we're looking tonight at Numbers, from pilgrimage to possession, and this book gives us a travelogue of the wilderness journey. It chronicles them on the backside of the desert from Mount Sinai to the border of Canaan by the River Jordan. And I got to say to you, beloved, that this book is so crucial to unfolding of God's covenant promise given to their fathers, which did include inheritance and occupation of a land. Like the tabernacle, Canaan would be the focal point of Yahweh's residence among men, the place where his sovereignty would find historical expression through his specially chosen people. However, entrance into this land required pilgrimage and conquest. Between covenant promise and covenant possession lay a process of rigorous journey through hostile opposition of terrain and terror. So we've got here pilgrimage and conquest in Numbers. And yet they never truly take the land, as you would see in your reading of the book of Joshua, because they lived disobedient to the covenant. So in clearly military fashion, Moses enacts a census of the tribes in chapter 1 of Numbers. He arranges the encampment in chapter 2 with the Levites, the keepers of Yahweh's dwelling place, surrounding the tabernacle. And one of your handouts tonight that I'll refer to shows them, the tribes, and how they are the north and south and east and west of the tabernacle. So I probably gave you time enough to find Numbers where hopefully your pages are not sticking together. Numbers chapter 1. Let's beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month, in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take a census of all the congregation of the sons of Israel by their families, by their fathers' households, according to the number of names, every male, head by head. From 20 years old and upward, whoever is able to go out to war in Israel, you and Aaron shall number them by their armies. With you, moreover, there shall be a man of each tribe, each one head of his father's household. These then are the names of the men who shall stand with you: of Reuben, Elizur, the son of Shedeur, of Simeon, Shalumim. And we can kind of fast track through several verses here. After verse 15, verse 16, these are they who were called of the congregation, the leaders of their fathers' tribes. They were the heads of divisions of Israel. And by the way, I didn't skip over the names just so that you won't know how bad I am at pronouncing names, but for time's sake, you get the gist. So Moses and Aaron took these men who had been designated by name, and they assembled all the congregation together on the first of the second month. Then they registered by ancestry and their families, by their fathers' households, according to the number of names from 20 years old and upward, head by head, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So he numbered them in the wilderness of Sinai. Now, stop for a moment. Numbered them. You see where we get the name of the book? Verse 20. Now the sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, their genealogical registration by their families, by their fathers' households, according to the number of names, head by head, every male from 20 years old and upward, whoever was able to go out to war. Their numbered men of the tribe of Reuben were 46,500. Now, if you notice down in verse 23, you got Simeon. Verse 25, Gad. 27, Judah. 29, Issachar. 31, Zebulun. Verse 33, Ephraim. Verse 35, Manasseh. Verse 37, Benjamin. 39 is Dan. 41 is Asher. 43 is Naphtali. And verse 46, we've got a total of the numbers 604,550. And friends, before you are quick to dismiss and say something like these being useless historical facts for other people, the Jews, but what about us? Remember Paul's reminder to the saints at Rome, the saints at Corinth, or hey, the saints at Grace Bible Church. A biblical view of history is theological. It's not merely academic regarding the names and dates and numbers. You've heard it said before that history is capital H, his story, and our learning of him who has not changed, though now he is working primarily through the church, not the nation Israel, though he hasn't forgotten them. Now, if you notice, next to your handouts in the foyer, there is a little picture, a little graph for you. To the north of the tabernacle, you've got Dan and Asher and Naphtali, total of 157,600. Over to the east, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Over to the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin. And down in the south, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Think about this. This is a small little graph, a small picture, but I want you to contemplate the enormity. Their tents occupy several square miles since there's so many people in the census. Over 600,000 that are numbered, but These numbered are 20 and above, able to go to war, heads of households. So there's a whole lot more than the over 600,000. It requires between 1.5 to 2.5 million people. Notice again, back in verse 20, in regards to Reuben, their genealogical registration by their families, by their fathers' households, according to the number of names, head by head, every male from 20 years old and upward, whoever was able to go out to war. So these are the heads of the households. You add in all the other people. This is a whole horde of people that God has created for the praise of his great name. Now, a little bit about the title and background. In the Hebrew, you'll have to take this by faith unless you've learned the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, in the wilderness of. As is typical, it's taken from the first verse, the fifth word, which tells us, and Jehovah spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. So in the Hebrew, this is the book about the wilderness. It's used 48 times. The wilderness is little vegetation or trees and can't be cultivated due to lack of rain. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it gets its name Numbers because of the prominence of figures. The Hebrew title is still appropriate because of its general theme of God's continual training of Israel. Where is he training them? On the backside of the desert. Hardly any vegetation or trees, can't even cultivate the land. It's a description of the total contents. There's a numbering at the beginning of the book, a numbering at the end, and between the beginning and the end is the wilderness wandering, a transition from the old and disobedient generation to the new generation. You remember God's promise that he's going to lay low in the wilderness the disbelieving generation that didn't trust him, which if we have time tonight, we'll look at. How about the timing of the book? It covers a larger span than any other in the Pentateuch except for Genesis. You got 40 years of discipline. I'm giving you a round figure. It's more like 39 years. It embraces the whole period from the second month of the second year after the Exodus from Egypt to the 10th month of the 40th year. So 40 years to the day from the first Passover in Egypt to the second Passover. And I believe on the back of your handout, you've actually got a chronology of Israel's journey from Egypt to Canaan. As the way from Goshen, which was in Egypt, to Sinai was a preparation of the chosen people for their reception into covenant with God. So the way from Sinai to Canaan was also preparation for the possession of the promised land. We'll talk about it in just a moment. What's the theme of the book? You see very clearly the consequences of disbelief and disobedience to a holy God. He disciplined, but he remained faithful to his covenant promises, displaying patience and holiness and justice and mercy and sovereignty towards people. You look at some of these events and you say, ay caramba, what a long-suffering God we have. You know, three main truths to hang your thoughts on. Number one, we're instructed in the fickleness of the human heart, lest we get exalted in our prideful opinion of how great our faithfulness and closeness to Yahweh is. Man is fickle. You know, as I was talking with a pastor friend of mine today and given some counsel, I said, I trust that you're training fellow leaders that if you think that you could not blow it royally and not finish strong to the glory of God, then you are stronger than Samson, you are godlier than David, and wiser than Solomon, three Old Testament saints that royally botched it in sexual sin. And so we get taught some humility and how fickle our human hearts are. We think we're this far down the road of holiness when we're probably back here somewhere. That ought to give us pause in prayer. I wish more elders would preach this to themselves and would keep them nearer to the cross rather than little sellouts here and there until they eventually disqualify themselves from ministry. Second of all is the patience of God. And friends, we can't get swept up into the patience of God too much. Thirdly, the painful reality of judgment against rebellion. Justice and righteousness demands that response towards unrighteousness. God would not be just, he would not be holy if he didn't respond to unholiness. How about the outline of the book? You've got the ordering of the people of the Exodus, chapters 1 to 10, disorder among the people in the wilderness, chapters 11 to 25, and the reordering the new generation for entrance, chapters 26 to 36. And I don't know if any of you have taken me up on the challenge and the encouragement to memorize the Bible book flashcards, but this is the outline that I've got on there. And so think about this. You spend a little time memorizing a 3-point outline. Every time you go to Numbers, you can rehearse in your mind really quickly. Here's the main sections of the book. We've mentioned, as we've outlined the previous books of the Pentateuch, you can outline them geographically. So you've got the preparation of the people back in Sinai. You've got the people not trusting God at Kadesh, chapters 11 to 16, and the perseverance of God with the people of Moab, chapters 17 to 36. Or if you wanted a third one, you got the experience of the old generation in the wilderness, chapters 1 to 25, and the prospects of the new generation to enter the promised land, chapters 26 to 36. Bright is the horizon for that new generation. You'll notice that I didn't give you a whole lot on the chronology of Numbers. I simply put a note here. See the handout. There's another handout for you. If you were to walk through the date of the events, it's from 1446 BC to 1406 BC. Though I'm not spending time here, I provide it because it helps some who struggle with timing and want to see how clearly the scriptures lay it all out, and that we can have the answers, we can be firm on dates, and we know how God's history has unfolded when you go to pull from the text all the dates and places and people in that chronology of Numbers. And it goes from the second year down to the 12th month. But we don't want to spend time there right now. That's for your own edification during tea time tomorrow. Some major themes. 7 I'd draw your attention to. I said that 48 times you've got the wilderness referred to, and you've got these chapters, 1, 3, 9, and following. You've got the rebellion of Israel. You really see that rebellion in capital R rebellion with the asterisk next to the chapters, 14, 20, and 25. We'll look at a couple tonight. A third major theme, as you read through the book from cover to cover, is the wrath of God towards his disobedient people. This is not new. You see how unfaithful teaching in the church has affected people so that there are so many Christians that have not developed a biblical theology of the wrath of God, that it's something that we're almost ashamed to mention, and yet it's all through Scripture. It's a major theme as God's people are fickle and disbelieving and disobedient, so that elicits the wrath of God. A fourth theme would be the blessing of God through Balaam, chapters 23 and 24. Maybe we'll look at that next week. The Numbers, which puts on a banner in our minds the glory and the grace of Yahweh. When you have a few people, 70 to be exact, that went into Egypt land, and what came out of Egypt? A mighty nation. And here you've got 1.5 to 2 million people populating around the tabernacle. It's incredible, the glory and grace of Yahweh. You've got the old and new, which is the patience of Yahweh. As the previous generation in their disobedience dies off and litters the wilderness along the years, so you've got that new generation, and the prospect is beautiful as you see the patient God that didn't snuff them all out, who would have been right to do so. And then you got the land. You may have heard me mention before that in the nominal Bible church I grew up in, from my very early years as a Christian, was dispensational in my theology because you look at the land promises, and as there is literal detail of promise, so there must be literal detail of fulfillment and the land promises. So why don't you wander with me through some events in the wilderness to glean from them. Let's move from chapter 1 over to chapter 11 if we could. Not too many years ago, probably 6 or 7, for harvest dinner in another church, I think my devotional challenge came from Numbers 11. We can learn a lot about our own fickle hearts due to somebody else's complaining, since we don't want to admit to our own quite as readily. Notice verse 1. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because of the fire of the Lord burned against them. So here you've got complaint. Lord, this really sucks. And then Moses, the greatest leader in the Old Testament, he starts complaining. Why don't you care about me? I think that's verse 10, right? Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. So you got complaining people, complaining leader. I guess we skipped over verse 4, didn't we? Where he kind of informs us a little of what was going on. He says, the rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Now, Numbers is a few books removed from Genesis, is it not? And what was the lying serpent, the tempter, doing at the very beginning in Genesis 3? He's questioning the goodness of God. And we focus on not what we have in his lavish grace, but what we don't have. And so the human heart doesn't change a whole lot. And so, yes, Moses is displeased. Why don't you care about me? Because I got to lead these people, a bunch of complainers. Do they really have anything to complain about? Do they really have not? Well, let's go a little further in the chapter. Look at verse 31. So the complaint, the greedy desires they had back in verse 4, they're complaining, who's going to give us meat to eat? What were they having? God was raining down manna. All we got is constant sustenance. And it's boring. Well, we got plenty to eat, but it's not what we want to eat. Okay, verse 31. There went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. So let's think about this. In our measuring stick, our tape measure, a couple of cubits, you got 3 feet deep quail. It's pretty lavish. And then you got complaint. Let's continue on. Verse 32, people spent all day, all night, all the next day and gathered the quail. That's a lot of food. Got at least 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. And while the meat was still between their teeth, they hadn't even had time to get their toothpicks out. Before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had been greedy. So we get a lesson in complaint and greediness rather than gratitude and thankfulness for God's lavish care. Is that the only rebellion and disbelief going on? No, you get to the next chapter. Not too far away. Miriam and Aaron murmur. And what do they get for their murmuring? The consequence of their disobedience, leprosy. And they bear shame for 7 days as a consequence of their sin. Chapter 13. This is a good account. You got spies going into the land. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send out for yourself men so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them." How many tribes of Israel do we have that's already been put around the tabernacle? 12. So how many spies go into the land? 12. Okay. Glad we're all together here. Verse 3, right? So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran at the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the sons of Israel, and these were their names. And again, I know you're not going to believe me that I don't want to show how bad I pronounce names, but I'm fast forwarding to verse 17. When Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, he said to them, "Go up there into the Negev, then go up into the hill country, see what the land is like, and whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or mighty. How is the land in which they live? Is it good or is it bad? How are the cities in which they live? They are open camps or with fortifications? How is the land? Is it fat or is it lean? Are there trees in it or not?" Because, again, what was the wilderness like? It's desert land. You can't even cultivate the soil. It's so hard. "Make an effort then. Get some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes, so they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob at Lebo-Hamath. When they had gone up into the Negev, they came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, and the descendants of Anak were. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Now let's stop for a moment and think through some of what we read, some of what we didn't read. Spies go in, they spy out the land and the people, and the issue wasn't the giants, but that the fear of man trumped the fear of God. They're supposed to be marching under God's orders, not their experience and what looks too hard to overcome. From their own lips, what they confess in verse 27, notice it. They told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us. It certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. It flows with milk and honey. Verse 28, people who live in the land, they're strong. The cities are fortified. They're very large. And we saw the descendants of Anak there. But notice their conclusion, their interpretation of what they observed. Verse 31, the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go up again against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we've gone, is spying it out, is a land that devours its inhabitants. All the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. Oh no, our knees are shaking together. We skipped over that there's, out of the 12 people, the 12 spies that go in the land, 10 of them come back and say, no way, Jose, and only 2 of them say, let's take it. More disobedience, more unbelief. We started off with the account of chapter 11. We mentioned the account of chapter 12. We just read some more of another account in chapter 13. Does it get any better in chapter 14? Well, the people complain again. They say in chapter 14, we wish we had died in Egypt. Oh, do you really? So the 2 faith-filled men, the 2 faith-filled spies, the obedient ones, Joshua and Caleb, say the land's good. If the Lord's pleased with us, he'll bring us in. Just don't rebel and fear. What are they doing? They're rebelling and fearing. Verse 11, chapter 14. Lord, how long will they spurn me and not believe despite the signs? Think of this. The Lord says to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? How long will they not believe in me despite all the signs which I've performed in their midst? Is this not the lavish, gracious God that piled up 3 feet of quail and gave manna on a daily basis, who walked them through the Red Sea as if on dry land and smashed the army with the waters? Yeah, that one. That God. Moses intercedes, verses 14 to 19. All this sin and disobedience, this lack of faith, up to verse 22. Notice it. Numbers 14:22. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice. As if God in Canaan is going to be different than God in the wilderness and God in Egypt land. Do we not have New Testament authors who tell us that the God is the same yesterday, today, and what? Forever. And James comes along and tells us that God does not change. And yet, they, or we, put him to the test. He says these 10 times, not listen to my voice. We were just in verse 22, verse 23. They shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now let's rehearse here for a moment. Sinai to Canaan. It's an 11-day journey. How long did it take them? 40-year detour that they created for themselves. God says they shall by no means see that land. I can't even talk. He reiterates it. Verse 29, your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number, from 20 years old upward, who have grumbled against me. Old generation going to die, new generation will take the land. Verse 30, surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. 31, your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in. So the unbelievers say, our kids are going to die. God said, not only are they not going to die, but they're the ones that get to inherit the land. They will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness. According to the number of days which you have spied out the land, 40 days, for every day, in other words, every day of disobedience, you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. You buck against God, he's going to buck against you. Verse 37 rehearses how that the bad reporters died. Think unbelief is a small sin to God? Not at all. A shallow and temporary mourning, because in the morning they arose and rebelled again, verses 39 to 45. We got bad news of disbelief and disobedience. Chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14. Does it get any better in chapter 15? Well, in chapter 15, verse 32, you've got a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. They've already received the law. This is a no-no. Verse 35, stoned. And we need to read it in the context of what God commanded. Clear laws, unambiguous. He won't be trifled with. Obedience is not an option, but a necessity. The Lord said to Moses, verse 35, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp, stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Well, fortunately, it wasn't God burning him up on the outskirts of the camp for the complaining, but you still got a disobedient one here, and he has to have swift punishment. Chapter after chapter of fickle man, disbelief, disobedience, and yet a patient God who doesn't snuff them all out. You know, as you read through the book of Numbers, you see a lot of leadership issues. Go back to chapter 12. I simply told you what happens in chapter 12, but we didn't look at any of it. How about Miriam and Aaron? They're lifted up in pride. Without fear, they spoke against Moses. Who's Moses? God's spokesperson, God's man, God's leader, a humble and faithful servant. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he'd married. You know, this is a personality thing. It still goes on in the church today. It's not sin and righteousness. It's I don't like what you chose to do here, Moses. Chapter 16, more leadership issues. Korah's clan suggests that Moses and Aaron have exalted themselves above the assembly. They didn't just decide, we're going to lead this rabble. God's the one that anointed them. He appointed them. He called them to lead. Well, they as Levites, they're separated to the tabernacle service, and they clamored for authority, and they pushed for priesthood. And we still got those things going on today, thinking that leadership is a place of prestige and power rather than a pattern of righteousness to follow after. They gathered together against the Lord according to the text. Verse 13, 16:13. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, but you would also lord it over us? They're claiming Moses is lording it over them. Verse 14, you haven't done what you said that you would do. You haven't brought us into this land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. You know, they're focused in the wrong place. Is it on the faithful, humble leadership of Aaron and Moses, or their own disobedience that kept them out of that land that they weren't in? These are wicked men. Depart from them. So you got all this backbiting going on. Look down at verse 26. Let me find. He spoke to the congregation, saying, "Depart now from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing that belongs to them, or you'll be swept away in all their sins." Stay away from the backbiters, the slanderers, because you might get in on their judgment. Verse 34, all Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, "The earth may swallow us up." So after the earth swallowed them alive, others fearful of the same fate, we want to stay as far away from them as possible. And verse 40 is a reminder that no layman come near to burn incense. You know, they just had their Levites burned up to a crisp. Notice verse 41. But on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people." You see how ludicrous this is? God snuffed out the slanderers, preserved his leaders of his people, and then they escaped, they stayed away from them, and now they're doing the same thing, practicing the murmuring, and they get the plague that the rest of the chapter talks about. Grumbling, accusing Moses and Aaron of causing the death. So there's a lot that we glean in vivid technicolor, real flesh and blood in real historical time of people that are like us. And so as you read through the book of Numbers, possibly this week, notice some of these main themes: the wilderness, the rebellion of Israel, the wrath of God towards disobedience, his blessing, the old and the new, and the land that he promised. Let's look to him in prayer. Father, thank you for this book of all books, all 66 books contributing to the same storyline of a great and awesome, majestic God that we serve. Fickle, unfaithful man, faithful and patient God. God, help us to learn from what not to do and see your provision that we are to follow after. Help us to learn from them that we might be changed. Help us to be instructed. Help us to leave rich examples for others following in our footsteps. For the glory of God, we ask. Amen.